Today, prepare to be captivated as we embark on an unparalleled journey through the history and heartache surrounding the legendary Antonov An-225. Picture a flying colossus. The Antonov An-225, a marvel that redefined the limits of aviation. With 6 powerful engines, a wingspan stretching towards infinity, and a payload capacity that pushed the boundaries of imagination. The Antonov 225 wasn't just an aircraft. It was a testament to the audacity of human engineering. However, this script takes an unexpected turns as we navigate through the highs and lows of the airborne giant's legacy. From its maiden flight to the monumental cargo missions that etched its name into the skies, the Antonov 225's journey was a tapestry woven into ambition and innovation. But as fate would have it, even the highest giants can face a tragic end. In a twist that reverberated through the aviation community, the Antonov 225 confronted a fate that left us in disbelief and sorrow. Join me as we unravel the story of the Antonov 225, its rise to prominence, the glory it basked in, and the heart-wrenching descent that marked the end of an era. Welcome to Destination-Aviation. Listeners, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Jeff, coming to you from a very foggy Chicago area. It has been quite the aviation experience here for the last week with the warmer temperatures now and the snow melting, and it's just creating this lovely fog throughout this kind of northern Illinois section. A lot of flights canceled. O'Hare is one of the few airports around this area with RVR. Seems, I don't know, it's kind of weird. I don't know if they're lined up maybe with jet blast, but the RVR's runway visual range, it gives the pilots details of how far in the distance they can see down the runway. We don't have them at our airport where I am at, and most airports in the region don't, but it has been a slow shutdown because of that for our flights. We started seeing some on Friday come in, and as soon as one was able to land, they hit the minimums. There was just a cascade effect of flights onto the ground, but we have seen quite the change in temperature swing here. We dumped a ton of chemicals on our runway. As you know, if you start getting icing, which we've seen some of that here, it takes a while for that to break down. We use potassium acetate. It's expensive. If you go to O'Hare or Midway, they will dump it by the gallon, by the hour, millions of dollars worth of chemical. But myself, I have been keeping an eye on the weather. We are planning on going on a trip to Aruba. Yes, we were flying on Spirit Airlines. Didn't want to make that choice initially. Still don't really want to make that choice, but it was the best connection for us. And I think it'll be okay. We'll see. Been checking the weather. The weather looks good. Always get a little anxious just about getting onto the plane and getting out of Dodge, especially when it's such a nice area like Aruba. Never been, but if any of you have been, feel free to throw us an email at podcast. Yeah, throw it to podcast. How about dapodcast85@gmail.com. Drop us a line, say hi, say hello, say Aruba's great. We were told to get a rental car, so we're planning that, but honestly, just to spend some time together, that's really the key on this trip. But it could probably be anywhere. And we were thinking of the song from the Beach Boys, that Aruba, Jamaica, Kokomo. Kokomo, all we could find was Indiana. But quite honestly, if your company's good enough, Kokomo, Indiana, in our case, would probably be just fine. But we are looking forward to this Aruba trip. It's going to be fun. It's going to be enjoyable. We probably will hand out some podcast stickers along our way, along our journey. Finds us in places like Fort Lauderdale and then points south. So as we do in most of our podcasts, we start off with a little bit of news. I thought this was an interesting article. Some of you might have seen this about AI reducing contrails on aircraft, so artificial intelligence. Aviation makes up for about 3% of greenhouse gas emissions, but it is a big primary target. Things in the sky we hear all the time from people that we need to do better, every industry, right? So in this case, when they look at it, they're saying that and a reduction of contrails could happen with better flight planning. Basically, Google was testing these aircraft to reduce, through fluctuations in power, avoidance of certain areas of certain meteorological conditions. The study basically said that if 15% of flights use contrail avoidance through artificial technology, you could see a huge reduction in greenhouse gases. It would increase fuel consumption by about 3%. As we all know, air traffic control has a big play in this. The skies are busy. It's hard to say if aircraft could efficiently move around. But it's an interesting study nonetheless. It sounds like they're going to continue to look at this and see if there's broader implications that could happen that maybe will make this more of a realistic goal for operators of aircraft and give the pilots some latitude on how to avoid contrails. But very interesting. The FAA has signed off on plug door inspections for the 737 MAX 9. We talked about that last time on this podcast where the door went blowing off on Alaska Airlines. They are back up and running. Alaska's been flying theirs. United is done with their inspections. And so we're back off onto the MAX. So we won't be on that on Spirit. I think we're flying on a Neo, but nevertheless, they are back into the skies, and the FAA has their marching orders for Boeing to move forward. So we'll see. I do know that there's some stuff on the expansion of the MAX program that's not as favorable for Boeing, and some slowdown in production. But we'll continue to see the plagues of this aircraft. Hopefully, this will be the last one for them. This is an interesting story. Luckily, nobody got hurt. It's Southern Airways. It landed in Virginia on the runway, made a hard landing. It's a Cessna Caravan 208. There's pictures online of it. Landed on the interstate after a mechanical issue. It's actually interesting with Southern Airways. They don't fall under the 1,500-hour rule. We've talked about this with Senator Duckworth before. It's one of her main driving points with FAA reauthorization is that if you're a airline transport pilot, you need to have 1,500 hours of flight time, which came from the Colgan Air flight crash. But Southern Airways, the type that they fly under, they don't need to do that. They don't have the minimum retirement age of 65 either for pilots. So you end up in a situation where you have an older pilot with a lot of experience who no longer can work for the airlines, and then a younger pilot who's starting out who doesn't have 1,500 hours. So it's kind of a mixed bag. They fly a lot of essential air service flights. When I worked in the Pittsburgh area, there was a lot of those flights going into there from places like Altoona and Johnstown, and this looks like one of those type of operations. But kudos to the crew for getting it down on the road, not hurting anyone on the ground and not hurting anyone on the plane. The aircraft itself looks a little messed up, but that's to be expected. Looks like it ran into a guardrail there. This was just too funny. Our number one listener on this podcast, amazing listener, sent this over. A gassy man apparently caused a big stink aboard an American Airlines flight, according to a viral social media post. The plane eventually turned around when the passenger was asked to get off the plane. This stinky situation happened on January 14th during a flight from Phoenix to Austin. A Reddit user said an unidentified man on the plane was audibly disgruntled about something, maybe hungover, and he was grumbling before the plane left the gate. The man was allegedly swearing and causing a disruption. Later on in the flight, the man farted very loudly and said, "Yeah, everybody just eat the smelliest food possible at the same time." At this point, I guess a passenger had told to the man who was farting, "Why don't you take a private flight next time if you don't like what people are eating?" And the man who was farting said, "That's so fucking rude." While another person added, "I think you'll all agree you're the rude one here." Fartman then replied something like, "This is just so low class," and the other guy's rebuttal was, "Well, you're back here in economy with the rest of us." Flight attendants intervened and told the man that was farting that was enough. Soon after the announcement was made to the plane that the plane was returning to the gate. The man then got up, grabbed his belongings, and got off the aircraft. Everyone seemed relieved because they were on edge about what the man may say or do next. They also noted the flight was delayed about 15 to 30 minutes. They did kudos to American for handling it swiftly, and he claimed that they decided to share the experience because it's somewhat entertaining, and he did not film anything. He missed the opportunity to fart on the way out and said, "I'll smell you later," one person wrote. So, I don't know. I don't know if my brother was on this plane, because that sounds like something he would have done. Kidding. Let's just hope that doesn't happen on our flight to Aruba. But thank you so much for sharing that. It's such an entertaining story and so disgusting. I was on a flight once. It was so nasty. There was a girlfriend and her boyfriend in front of me. We were flying from Savannah, Georgia to Atlanta, Georgia on Delta. I think it was a 717 or an MD-90, something along those lines. And he had a zit on the back of his head, so they're in front of me. And then in the flight, she started to pop the zit on his head, which is disgusting. It did pop, and it ran down the back of his head and through his neck. So if you can imagine sitting in your seat witnessing this gross display of love in front of you. It was one of the nastiest things I've seen in public on an aircraft, which is why when I get home, I always strip the clothes off, throw them in the washer and dryer, and wash myself before I touch anything in this house, because you never know what you're contracting on that aircraft. But disgusting to witness. So hopefully Fartman finds a way to get on a private flight himself. But without further ado, let's get into our story here. We wanted to talk about the Antonov 225. I never had the pleasure of actually seeing the 225 at any of the airports I worked at, but I've seen its younger brothers and sisters in the Antonov family coming. A lot of funny stories. In Pittsburgh, before I worked there, they had the G20 summit, and there were some Russian Antonovs that came in. They loaded them up with cigarettes and items from Sheetz gas stations. And then they said that the mechanics got out, it stopped at the end of the runway. One jumped out, banged on the engine, got back into the aircraft, and then they took off. So anytime the Antonov shows up, it seems like there's always some sort of a cheeky story that airport personnel witness with that particular aircraft. But the Antonov itself, the development of it started in 1984 with a request from the Soviet government for a large airlifter as a replacement for the Meshev VMT. The specifics on the request included the ability to carry a maximum payload of 231,838 pounds, or 511,116 pounds. This was both externally and internally, while operating from a runway of less than 3,500 meters or 11,500 feet. As originally set out, the missions and objectives were broadly identical to that of the United States shuttle carrier aircraft, having been designed to airlift rocket boosters and orbital aircraft. I actually had the pleasure of seeing the 747 that carried a space shuttle when I was in California. I went to Moffett Field when they were transporting the space shuttle down to Los Angeles, and they did a low-pass flyover of Moffett Field because it is a NASA installation. But it was super cool to see, super awesome to see that in the sky going by overhead. Of course, with the Russians, at the time, Soviet Union, Russian, whatever, they had a rapid pace for development of the aircraft. I don't know if anybody's seen the space shuttles that they built. There's pictures online. Maybe we could do a podcast about that down the road. But they basically stole the information from NASA, and they built their own version of the space shuttles. And they've been sitting in this facility, this old hangar, and they're just kind of falling apart. But they're really identical to what the space shuttle program looked like. So it's not lost on, I think, anybody that, of course, they would rapidly push to have a carrier aircraft to transport those as well. And then when the Soviet Union fell apart, there wasn't funding to keep that program up and running, and it all went to mothballs. Now, the Antonov continued on, probably not so much necessarily with what its original mission was intended to be, but turned into a much used cargo aircraft for very large cargo developments. On December 21st of 1988, the An-225 performed its maiden flight. It made its first public appearance outside the Soviet Union at the 1989 Paris Air Show, where it was presented carrying a orbiter. 1 year later, it performed a flying display for the public days at the Farnborough Air Show. While 2 aircraft had been ordered, only a single An-225 was finished. It could carry an ultra-heavy and oversized freight weight of 500,000 pounds internally, so 250,000 kilograms, and a upper fuselage area could carry an additional 200,000 kilograms or 400,000 pounds. Cargo on the upper fuselage can be up to 230 feet in length, or should I say, could have been up to 230 feet in length. A second partial An-225 was partially built out during the late 1980s for Soviet space program. However, work on the airframe ceased with the collapse of the Soviet Union. By the year 2000, the need for an additional An-225 capacity had become apparent. During the September of 2006, it was decided that the second An-225 would be completed, a feat that was at one point scheduled to occur around 2008. However, the work was subject to repeated delays, and by August of 2009, the aircraft had not been completed and the work had been abandoned. In 2011, the Antonov CEO reportedly stated that completion of the second An-225, which would have been a carrying capacity of 250 tons, required at least $300 million. Upon provision and sufficient financing, its completion could be achieved in 3 years. According to different sources, the second aircraft was 60 to 70% complete by 2016. I don't know if anyone has seen online those pictures where someone has duplicated basically a bunch of engines across an aircraft. But in reality, the Antonov 225 really does kind of look like that, with 3 jet engines on each wing. It looks weird and off, but also really cool. And this thing has 32 tires on it. It's insane. It weighs more than an A380. This thing was massive. And the design of it could really, I mean, when you're talking about large cargo, the Antonov 225 was just everywhere. It was always carrying the largest and the biggest of cargo in aviation. The operational history of the Antonov 225 was originally operated between 1988 and 1991 as the primary method of transporting orbiters for the Soviet space program. By the time the Soviet Union was no longer in existence, the program for space travel had been terminated. Consequently, the sole completed Antonov 225 was left unused and without a purpose. As early as 1990, Antonov officials were openly speaking about their ambitions for the aircraft to enter commercial use. Despite this, in 1994, it was decided to put the AN-225 into long-term storage. During this time, all 6 of its engines were removed and used on various AN-124s, while the second uncompleted AN-225 airframe was also stored. As the 1990s progressed, it became clear that there was a sufficient demand for the cargo line even bigger than the AN-124. Accordingly, it was decided that the first AN-225 would be restored. The aircraft was re-engineered, received modifications to modernize and better adapt its heavy cargo transport operations, and placed back in service under the management of Antonov Airlines. It became the workhorse of Antonov Airlines' fleet, transporting objects once thought impossible to move by air, such as a 130-ton generator, wind turbine blades, and even diesel locomotives. It also became an asset to international relief organizations for its ability to quickly transport huge quantities of emergency supplies during multiple disaster relief operations. Under Antonov Airlines, the AN-225 received its type certificate from the Interstate Aviation Community Aviation Registry. The first flight of commercial service departed from Germany on January 3, 2002, and flew to Oman. With 216,000 prepared meals for American military personnel based in the region. The vast number of ready meals were transported on 375 pallets and weighed 187.5 tons. During 2016, Antonov Airlines ceased operation with Airfoil and partnered with Vogel-Deppner instead. This, in turn, led to the AN-225's legendary blue and yellow paint scheme that was added in 2009. These matched the colors of the Ukrainian flag and led the AN-225 becoming Ukraine's winged ambassador to the world, in the words of the New York Times. When the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the world in early 2020, the AN-225 participated in a relief effort by conducting flights to deliver medical supplies to China and other parts of the world. Of course, as everybody knows, and we all see them every time I'm at the airport, there's aviation enthusiasts out there with their cameras taking pictures and enjoying everything that comes in. This aircraft was the cat's meow, or as someone I know, the cat's ass would say, for just anybody that would see it would want to take a picture of it. And it had a following. That was the type of aircraft that this has. I mean, massive 2-tail, 2-nose wheels, just a huge presence of an aircraft. This aircraft has such a presence. It's almost like our number one fan. They have an amazing presence. Wherever they go, people just want to look and see it and say, this is freaking amazing. So, as we know, Soviet Union aircraft. This was Ukrainian now. Same thing as Chernobyl when there was the breakup of the Soviet Union. So we fast forward to the Ukrainian-Russian war. The aircraft's last commercial mission was in early February of 2022 to collect almost 90 tons of COVID-19 test kits from China and deliver them to Denmark via Kazakhstan. From there, it returned on February 5th to its base at the Antonov Airport in Hostomel, where it underwent an engine swap. On advice from NATO, it was prepared for evacuation, scheduled for the morning of February 24th, but on that day, Russia invaded. When the airfield being one of its first targets, a ban on civilian flights was quickly enacted by the Ukrainian authorities. During the ensuing battle on the Antonov Airport, the runway was rendered unusable. On February 25th, the AN-225 was said to be intact. On the 27th of February, a photo posted on Twitter of an object tentatively identified as the AN-225 was on fire in the hangar. A report by the Ukrainian edition Radio Liberty stated that the airplane was destroyed during the Battle of the Antonov Airport. which was repeated by Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba. The Antonov company initially refused to confirm or deny reports and said that they were still investigating them. Also, on February 27th, a press release stated that the An-225 had been destroyed by Russian forces. Several other aircraft with the same hangar as the An-225 at the time of the destruction were also destroyed or damaged during the battle. Now, Antonov had said they planned to rebuild the plane at Russia's expense. I don't think that's going to happen, but that's what they said. The restoration is estimated to take over $3 billion and over 5 years. The task was to ensure that the costs are covered by the Russian Federation, which caused the intentional damage due to Ukrainians' aviation and cargo sector. The Ukrainian government also said that it would be rebuilt. I highly doubt Russia's going to pay for it, but who knows? Maybe they will. So the aftermath of this incident, on March 1st, a new photograph taken since the initial conflict was tentatively identified as the tail of the aircraft protruding from the hangar, suggesting that it remained at least partially intact. However, the further evidence proved to show the aircraft is inoperable due to extreme damage it sustained. On the 3rd of March, a video circulated on social media showing the aircraft burning inside the hangar along with several Russian trucks confirmed the likely destruction. Nonetheless, Antonov stated again that until the aircraft is inspected by experts, its official status could not be fully known. On March 4th, Russian state television showed that first clear ground images of a destroyed aircraft and much of the front section missing. Following Russia's withdrawal from northern Ukraine, a second unfinished aircraft airframe was reported to be intact, despite Russian artillery strikes on the hangar housing the Antonov factory. It was alleged that Antonov Airlines knew about the invasion was very imminent and for quite some time, but did nothing to prevent the loss of the aircraft. There was a YouTube video that was put out that basically accused Antonov, the company management, of not doing enough to prevent the aircraft from destruction and having been advised by NATO to move the aircraft and get it into ready-to-fly status. Get it over to Germany, and the Antonov staff denied any of these allegations, but it was said. And it was said by a former Antonov pilot or current pilot. It doesn't really state which way. I'm assuming if he's making accusation, he's probably not a current pilot. On April 1st, drone footage of the Hostomel airport showed the destruction and the fuselage of this aircraft completely burned and destroyed, but its wings partially intact. It was later revealed that the right wing had been broken, but was held up by the engines resting on the ground. Investigations into rebuilding the An-225 are being undertaken, including the possibility of cannibalizing the second incomplete An-225 or salvaging the remnants of the first plane to finish the second. However, there are several obstacles to rebuilding. Many of the aircraft's Soviet-made components were from the 1980s and are no longer made. Engineers quote a price of $350 to $500 million, although there is uncertainty regarding whether or not it would be commercially viable and worth the cost. A former pilot of the Antonov 225 said, "It's impossible to talk about repair and restoration of this aircraft. We can only talk about the construction of another. Using individual components that can be salvaged from the wreckage and combining them with those that were back in the 1980s, intended for the construction of the second aircraft." On May 20th of 2022, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky announced his intentions to complete the second An-225 to replace the destroyed aircraft and as a tribute to all Ukrainian pilots killed during the war. In November of 2022, Antonov confirmed plans to rebuild the aircraft at an estimated cost of $500 million. At the time, the company did not state whether parts from the wrecked aircraft and the incomplete airframe would be combined to create a new flying aircraft or where funding might come from. 4 months later, Antonov confirmed that parts had been removed from the wrecked aircraft for future mating with the unfinished fuselage. In March of 2023, Ukrainian government announced that it had detained 2 of 3 Antonov officials suspected of preventing the Ukrainian National Guard from setting up defenses at the Hostomel airport in anticipation of the invasion. In April of 2023, Ukrainian prosecutors charged the former head of Antonov with official negligence for failing to order the aircraft flown to Germany ahead of the Russian invasion. The Ukrainian Security Service, who investigated the case, stated that according to investigation on the eve of the full-scale invasion, the An-225 was in proper technical condition, which allowed it to fly outside the Ukraine airspace if they intended to do so. Instead, the general director of the company did not give appropriate instruction regarding the evacuation. Such criminal actions of officials led to the destruction of the Ukraine transport plane. It is such a shame to see this aircraft destroyed, something that was revered in our industry, just as war in general, right? And in our fascination in industry and what we do here and people that listen to this, it's such a shame to see, the loss of life and then, ultimately this feat of engineering, was destroyed for really no purpose. But I did want to end on saying that there are some records on the Antonov aircraft. Hopefully they'll get the new one back up and running. But on the records, on August 11th of 2009, the heaviest single cargo item ever sent by air was loaded onto the An-225 at 16.23 meters or 53 feet and 3 inches long, or 4.27 meters or 14 feet and 0 inches wide. Its consignment, a generator for a gas power plant in Armenia, along with its loading frame, representative payload of 189,980 kilograms, which equivalent to 418,830 pounds. It was also transported a total payload of 247,000 kilograms, 545,000 pounds on a commercial flight. On September 11th of 2001, kind of interesting, I never had heard this, September 11th of 2001, we all know what that is for everything else. That's probably why I've never heard of this, because of what else happened in aviation on that day. Carrying 4 main battle tanks, this set a record of 253.82 tons, and the aircraft flew at an altitude of 10,750 meters or 35,270 feet over a closed circuit of 1,000 kilometers or 620 miles at a speed of 763.2 kilometers per hour or 474.2 miles per hour during 2017 at a higher cost of $30,000 per hour is what it cost at that time. On June 11th of 2010, the An-225 carried the world's longest piece of cargo at 42.1 meters or 138 feet. It was a wind turbine blade that was sent from China to Denmark. And then on 2012, September 27th, the An-225 hosted the highest altitude art expedition in the world at 33,301 feet or 10,150 meters above sea level during an airspace show at the Antonov Airport. The expedition was part of the Globus Gallery based in Kyiv and consisted of 500 artworks and 120 Ukraine artists. In total, the An-225 set 240 world records, which is unique in aviation. So even unique in the sense of how many records that this aircraft holds. So wanted to give a little bit of background. We were talking in the office the other day about the Antonov, some of the other ones that are still flying, obviously this large one that's missing. And I kind of didn't know the background. I had heard some of the rumors that they wanted to, look at rebuilding one, but this was more my edification, and everybody that listens here seems to like what we talk about. So I hope that you enjoyed this. I don't think I'll probably get another one of these out, and I sure as heck am not going to do anything in Aruba besides just enjoy ourselves. But I hope everybody is doing well. I hope that you're getting by within the winter season. And until next time, my friends, I will see you down the runway.